time for the Double Stop with Brian Sword.
Welcome to the Double Stop Podcast. I'm Brian Sword. This week, we've got producer Richie Zito. Now, I gotta say that Richie Zito has had one heck of a career. From being signed to a major record deal at age 15, to all the bands he played guitar for and wrote with, to all the albums he's produced, and even today, working on shows like American Idol and The Voice, his career is really kind of mind-blowing. So here's my conversation with Richie Zito, and you can hear about it from the man himself.
How do you do it? Walk me through it.
I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and I was the only one in my family that, pursued music. My dad was musical, but no one had the bug and the commitment, and no one got, bitten that hard. So, I'm the only one that took it to a level that I did, and like that.
What caused the bug? Where did that come from?
I don't know. I listen to oldie stations now. I listen to satellite. I listen to everything, but I kind of, go through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. And when I listen to the 50s, I know the lyrics and at least, if not all of them, the melodies of songs. I was born in 1952. So, if it is the 50s, the oldest I could have been was 8. At the oldest. And there were some that I knew I actually bought the records. So even... So I was in it. I was in it from the minute, that I first woke up. And also it was the 50s. It wasn't quite yet the 60s, but that's kind of how it started. It was kind of like always there. I always felt like I was born, a musician.
And was guitar your first instrument?
Yes. Kind of first and only. You know what I mean? Because it's, then the Beatles came along, and then everybody got bitten. And I just sort of stayed. I stayed on the bus. So there it was like everybody wanted to be a rock star. Actually, believe it or not, in the 50s I wanted to be a pop star because I'm old, so I'll tell you how old I am. And so like in the 50s, I wanted to be like, one of the little pop teen idol guys. But then in the 60s it became more, more realistic, more fun, more intriguing. And Beatles came along, got my first guitar when I was about... I was born in 52. Beatles came out in 64-ish. I probably got my first real guitar, first electric guitar at about 12, and then I started from there.
And were you one of those guys who disappeared for the next 3 years while they learned how to play guitar?
I don't know. I've never been the most, sort of disciplined, kind of practicer. Of course I did. The way I practiced mostly was listen to people's records and try to figure out the chords and try to figure out the stuff. I got better and better and better. And my first real recollection is, getting together with a friend of mine and sitting down. I was thinking about it today because I went out and bought a guitar and it was like a long drive. And I was thinking about it today as I was listening to some Beach Boy stuff. That's how I remember getting together in my buddy's dining room, a couple of acoustic guitars, trying to play Beach Boy songs. So it was like before I took the idea of musicianship seriously, it was more and more about being in a group and making music happen.
And how quickly till you're in your first band?
Then, right there. I was signed to Atlantic Records when I was 15. So, I started early, and then I got lucky early. We weren't successful, but it was like going to Harvard. Only Harvard's still there, So
how does one even get signed at 15? How does that even happen?
Somehow we came on the radar of someone named Bob Gallo, who had a production deal with Atlantic Records. And at the time, Bob had a studio on 42nd Street in Manhattan. And he did, it's like James Brown, it's a man's world. The Rascals, the Young Rascals, back then in the day, recorded all their stuff there. So, we were pushy little Brooklyn kids. We got an audition. He liked us. And the great thing is since he had an actual production deal, we got to work there together, our band and him. So we, spent a couple of weeks, a couple of months kind of learning the trade. And then then we started to record some stuff, and he played it for Jerry Wexler, one of the 3 founders of Atlantic Records. He liked it and signed us. Again, it wasn't a super successful, beginning. However, it was the same year they signed Led Zeppelin and the Bee Gees, and they had the Stax Volt catalog, so they had Otis Redding, Wilson Pickett, Aretha Franklin, And so, you know what I mean? We were there at a very, 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 sort of integral part of the history of, what was popular music. So, you know what I mean? So I got in seriously at 15.
And then record comes out, you were probably 16? Record comes out?
Yeah, about 16. It was really funny because we did a couple of singles that came out, and then sort of, we drifted apart from the label. We really didn't have, what we needed to get to that next level. But it was kind of fun. I was in the studio with Tom Dowd, and he would like talk over the talkback and say, "Hey Zito, are you playing a pickup going into the chorus?" And I said, "What's a pickup?" so you know what I mean? I got to really, I can't thank that world enough. And then we left, and then I sort of, banged around as a kid. I was 16, 17 actually when we left Atlantic, and then I wound up, from 17 to 20, I don't remember, playing in bands, in clubs and in New York, and then I came to LA in 1973.
And what'd you do in LA? What was your first move there? Forming a band?
I worked with someone named Bobby Hatfield from the Righteous Brothers. I don't know who's listening. I don't know who, the ages and any of that kind of stuff, and their experience with, the history of us. Anyway, I started playing with Bobby Hatfield for a minute. Went in the studio, did some gigs, did a small tour, and then came back from that thing, started a band with Rick James, which was a lot of fun. Made a record together. He was a good young guy, man. He was a talented mother. And, he'd grab any instrument, usually a guitar, play one note, and write a song. And then I came, then you start to meet people, and I started going into the studio a little bit, and I wound up, an artist named Neil Sedaka was having a comeback in the mid-'70s. He started working with, 10cc, some of those guys, and he wound up on Elton John's Rocket Records. And so, I just sort of got called for a TV show and played with him on a television show, and he started to have a really big hit single. He had a pretty big comeback. He did a duet with Elton John. So, I did that, and that took me around for a couple of years, and I came back to LA. I left that because I always wanted to be in the studio, and then I spent the next few years making records as a guitar player.
Now, while you were as a session musician then, is that when you started kind of absorbing the production side?
Well, the greatest thing in the world about being a musician in that day, it sadly doesn't exist now for people that want to, start. They have to start their own, their own way, find their own way. Is I got to work with like the greatest producers. I got to work with Gus Dudgeon. I got to work with Chris Thomas. I got to work with Gene Page as an arranger who did the strings on Philadelphia Freedom for Elton. I got to work with the list is really and truly endless. And then I got to work with artists that were, like childhood, I was trying to think of what I did, like, because sometimes I get confused about, at which side of the 80s, you know what I mean? And so, I'd just get into the studio, I'd learn a lot of things. I learned a lot of Beatle tricks from Chris Thomas, because, he did part of the White Album. He did Nevermind the Bollocks with the Pistols. He did First Pretenders. And he had some great, now you read books about him, and now with the technology, you don't need to go through it. But, those guys were carving their initials in the stone, So that was a real true, I can't say how lucky I was, because anybody, even in those days, things have changed so drastically these days in terms of what a producer's role is. Everything's a little different. And
what would be the difference then? Well,
essentially every single record you hear on the radio is a result of sequencing and or sampling, and sort of the only sort of thing that would be organic would be a singer, and then they're fairly, heavily tuned. So at that point it becomes like, for me, it becomes the song. So it seems like the guys that are making records are sort of the writer-producers. And then I can go beyond that, because some of these records take 11 writers, because they have someone writing a track, they have, someone writing a rep, someone writing a melody, top-line stuff. So the era of, temporarily, Because who knows? There's not a lot of there are not a lot of records being made that are finding their way to the kind of center of the culture where there's a lot of actual musical instruments that are being played. How's that?
Okay.
You know what I mean? Like there's a lot of cool,
Yeah.
you'll get an Imagine Dragons, you'll get like a Mumford and Sons, despite the genre, whether you like it or not, they're in the minority, I think, of, when you think of pop music, you think of all the other, Beyoncé's and, Katy Perry's and Sia and, the list is endless again, but those aren't really, no one's actually grabbing a guitar, much less playing in a room with other human beings. That's the other thing that I really had the pleasure, as a guitar player in sessions, working like with, people like, you'd look over and it would be Ringo. You'd look over and it would be, James Gadsden. You'd look over it would be Jeff Porcaro. You look over it would be Chuck Rainey. It's like, the ability to learn how to play with other people at the same time. And that's another thing that doesn't exist anymore. But that stopped in the 80s even. To play with the same people at the same time and, sort of like where the track moves a little bit or somebody will play something and it'll inspire something else. And those kinds of things were a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful part of my life. And that's also a key difference. But that, like I said, that happened in the 80s. People started like putting stuff down one at a time, which is cool. But like I said, I was a session guy, so like I did stuff where, on top of what we were cutting would be obviously vocals, perhaps strings, perhaps horns. So basically a lot of times it was rhythm section stuff. So, like sort of like, like back in the day when like, Duck Dunn and Steve Cropper, who I did sessions with, that was their thing too. They were cutting tracks and learning how to, all that stuff. So all that stuff really did come in handy when I started to produce records, whether or not I did them that way.
Now, as a session player who was primarily inspired by the Beatles, how was it to work with Ringo?
It was unbelievable. It was sensational. I looked over and there was like, I don't know if it was the same drum, but rumor has it, someone I know that works with him, it was like one or three snare drums, and you look over and there would be that same black pearl drum that you saw on TV in 1964 on the Ed Sullivan Show. So that was, and then like, Klaus Vormann would be playing bass, things people you only read about. So, how you get, you get affected. Same thing happened to me when I was in the studio with the Beach Boys. I worked with, I played guitar on one of their songs. It was kind of in the day of disco when everybody did disco tracks. But then I did a whole album with Bruce Johnston, who, Johnson? Can't remember. And, Bruce kind of, went on the road starting decades ago. So, just, it happens. It just happens that way. But yeah, Beatle, it's hard to beat a Beatle. Again, as a player and producer, I had the pleasure of working with, on Tina Turner's Private Dancer record. I worked on the same track as Jeff Beck. I produced the Neville Brothers, wound up working on a track with Keith Richards. Did a lot of sessions with Steve Cropper, worked with James Burton on a lot of sessions. These are heroes. These are heroes. I'm trying to think who else I played with, guitar player-wise, because that's always been sort of like, fun for me to get an opportunity to play with people that I admire, especially guys like Beck.
For when you joined Elton John's band, was that as you were kind of moving on from session playing, or were you still knee deep as a session player?
No. I was actually, I mean, there's something about me that always wanted to be in the studio. As a kid, whenever I heard, for some reason, I'm a summer kid. I was born in August, and I loved the summer. I loved summer records because they always felt different to me than other records. And the idea of like, I wanted to create on some level or be part of, I didn't even understand it at that point, history, not necessarily the Declaration of Independence, but I wanted to be able to, the things that I heard, I knew I was, savvy enough at that point, they were made one time only. You heard a lick, you heard of something that wasn't done 27 times in 27 different cities, it was done once. So, I was always attracted to that, to that thing. So, between 75, I actually met Elton doing sessions. I met him through, actually I had met him through Neil Sedaka, but I wound up working with Nigel Olsson. Him and I became pals, and we did some sessions, and Elton came and played. And then I got called to play on Elton's record. That's how I started. So, he asked me to join a band after actually recording in the studio, which was probably the greatest thrill of my life. It's certainly the highlight of of my musician career. It doesn't get better than to stand on stage and be, just be part of, on any level, of that sort of talent. Yeah, it's a brilliant. I got to play in New York, which is my hometown, as I said, in front of 450,000 people at Central Park. So, that shit that's, you know what I mean? It's like me and, I was like, wow, there's probably just me and a few dictators that have done this. So that's where my guitar playing took me. You know what I mean? It just took me places that, anyway, the reason I stopped there is because before I played with Elton, I worked with a guy named Giorgio Moroder, who, whoever doesn't know who he is, he's getting a lot of, he's getting the kind of attention he deserves. This is his third career, but he worked on the Daft Punk record, and they did a track called Giorgio by Moroder, and they kind of created a track, and then the top line was him, the answers like this. He was being interviewed, and he answered, the questions, talking about, his sort of pioneering into synthesized music. And if anyone that doesn't know, Giorgio won 3 Oscars, like one for Midnight Express, things that go back a lot of years. And, he kind of almost single-handedly invented disco with all the Donna Summer records. And so, again, somehow I got called, because you get called, and I got called to play on a session for him. And the first thing we did was a duet with Barbra Streisand and Donna Summer. It's called Enough Is Enough. Again, I don't know who's listening to this thing. It's, I'm going back decades. And
it's a wide range, so go for
good.
it.
I mean, and that was kind of cool too, because that was one of those things that was, it was the first. Let me see. It was a platinum single, a platinum 12-inch, and it appeared on 2 different platinum records. So it was kind of groovy, Anyway, we did that, and then I never remember what came first. And then I worked on a movie called Midnight Express. I played guitar on Call Me, the Blondie song. And then at the end of that movie, I did something. Holy shit's on YouTube now. It makes me very happy. I did something at the end with Harold Faltermeyer, and we did a Mozart 5-piece. It was Mozart. It was 5. It was a concerto for clarinet, 5-part clarinet, and we did it together, like synth and guitar. And then Keith Forsey played some of the drums. Billy went up to produce Billy Idol, and anyway, sort of, I dropped out of that little world, and I went on the road with Elton, made some records. And then when I came back, I bumped into Giorgio's. Actually, it was a party. I think it might have been Bernie Taupin's, one of his birthday parties. And we reconnected and started working on some stuff that he was doing. And then, lo and behold, we did, Jerry Bruckheimer and Don Simpson came to him and said, we need some help on this track, on this movie, so we did Flashdance. And I played some guitar. And,
oh, great.
Yeah, and all of a sudden,
little movie.
It was cool. At the time, it was one of those movies that was like one of the first films that utilized those like MTV quick edits.
Yeah.
And so it was like a big, giant, beautiful video at the time, and and breakdancing. So it kicked a hole in the culture, and the fabric at that moment. And so and that was also sort of the beginning of soundtrack records, selling like 10, 15 million copies. So as you can imagine, the phone never stopped ringing, and then we just went on from that. I, gave up anything else and just worked exclusively with him. And I was happy because, everything he did was, to me, very interesting because, he came from a European perspective. And so, I got to grow a lot in that scene. And then we did a bunch of stuff. Then we did Top Gun. Like I played guitar on Danger Zone, and then we did we wound up doing Scarface, which is one of my favorites. I wound up playing all the guitars on that and did some of the arranging, wrote the lyrics on all the songs. And then what else did I do? And then Harold did Beverly Hills Cop, and I played guitar on The Heat Is On, and then Keith Forsey produced Billy Idol, and I played guitar on a couple of songs on Billy's first album that started as an EP. So, we were bouncing back and forth, and I was part of something really special. And that whole thing sort of led me into record production.
And it sounds like you were going nonstop there for quite a few years. Just one to the
next. Life has been so good. I can't put it into words. How grateful. I mean, I used to be like, forget about how I used to be. Here's how I am now. I couldn't be more. forget the brag. I'm not really that guy anyway, but the gratitude for stuff that no one will ever be able to do again, because I don't mean accomplish, I mean have the privilege and the pleasure of being around those kind of talented people and sort of going toe to toe with them and helping make some things that were part of the culture as well as being hit records.
And when you moved into production, what were some of the first records you worked on?
Well, one of the first things I did with Giorgio, because I really sort of idolized him, and I did a co-production with him, a band called Berlin, and we did a song called No More Words, and big K-Rock kid out here. Where are you, by the way?
I'm in Vancouver.
Oh, Vancouver. And then, oddly enough, I played on Take My Breath Away later. But so that happened, and that was good. And then I wound up working with Tony Basil, Hey Mickey, You're So Fine. And then I did some of the album, and then I wound up producing the Motels, and for those who know Martha Davis. And then I sort of connected with my first hit record, which was Eddie Money. We did a song called Take Me Home Tonight that featured Ronnie Spector, from the Ronettes. And that was the first, in my opinion, real hit record that I had as a record producer.
And in those early productions, were you still playing guitar and writing with them,
always.
or was it strictly producer?
The only people I was working with were Giorgio. I wasn't working for anybody again. And because I got that, I worked, and as I play guitar once with, I keep forgetting the things I care about. Like I worked with Chuck Berry, and then I can kind of get that. Luckily, thanks to YouTube, it's a lot of fun having done that. And so at that point, I stopped doing any of that stuff and just worked exclusively with Giorgio and started to produce records. And then once Eddie Money, blessed, hit, probably 86, 87, 88, that record happened. Then the next record I did pretty soon after was Cheap Trick. We got a hit with a song called The Flame. And, I always felt like, if you do it once, you could have got, maybe you were lucky. If you do it twice, they start to pay attention.
And that was such a huge song.
It was good, yeah. It was good. They didn't want to record it because they didn't write it, but I'm very proud of it. Whenever I hear it, I feel real good about it.
And then Heart would have been around the same time, right?
Yeah, it started to get fun. Again, when if you're lucky enough to get some success, then they come to you with some of the projects that, are kind of earmarked, more than others for success. But I did some fun shit in between. I worked with Joe Cocker and I produced a song called You Can Leave Your Hat On for 9.5 weeks, strip scene with Kim Basinger. So in between, I did a track with one of the greatest things that I've ever experienced 10 years after, Alvin Lee. And anybody who's ever seen the Woodstock movie should see it if they haven't. He was one of my favorite guitar players as a kid. And a really brilliant talent, in my opinion. So I did a track with Little Richard for Casper, of all movies. And, right? And,
hey, whatever, man. If it gets you in the studio with him. Right?
And then I got a phone call from Alvin Lee. He tracked me down to tell me that was one of his favorite records ever. So, it was those little moments that really, that took me through life. But, the next, I don't know if it was next, but I did a Heart record shortly thereafter, and it was pretty successful. And then from that, I went into a band called Bad English, which was essentially today's Journey with John Waite.
Another big record, too.
Yeah, we did good, but then again, I had the luck and the good fortune and all that stuff of working with really talented people. I think that's one of the key. I hate sounding like the old guy because I do listen to music all the time. I'm pretty current. Well, I'm actually more than pretty current. I'm current. I know what's going on. And I listen to the hits. I like hits. To me, hits are always hits for a reason. They're not accidents. But sometimes I don't hear too many Elton Johns these days. I don't hear too many Beatles these days. I don't hear too many of those kind of people. Like when I listen to the radio, again, I'm not a 16-year-old girl, but, sometimes it's not so easy for me to really tell the difference between some of the girl singers. There's so many out there. But whenever you heard Joe Cocker, it was Joe Cocker. You know what I mean? And the list goes on. So I got a chance to work with people of that magnitude. So yeah, whatever the question was, that's the answer.
Now, when you worked with a guitar player like Neil on Bad English, being a player yourself, how did it influence how you worked with him?
I did nothing. I pressed the button and he played. And he was brilliant. He's one of the most, of all the guitar players I've ever worked with, he's certainly one of the top, if not the top guy with the melodic sensibility that he has. When you listen to Don't Stop Believin' and you listen to his solo and it gets to a high note and then a second guitar comes in and plays the harmony. Yeah, his melodic sensibility was sensational. One of the things I liked best about Neil was he understood, the moment, and he understood sort of, capturing something. So whenever we cut tracks, he didn't play the solos afterwards. He played the solo on the track, and then afterwards he'd overdub a rhythm guitar. I thought that was pretty groovy. So you know what I mean?
Wow.
Here it is.
Yeah.
And so he really did do that, and it was really, really great. Yeah, he's a great musician. I think he's underrated. I think Journey gets a lot of attention now, but I think at their heyday they were so well known for such great songs and great playing and great production. I don't know that he got the individual attention as some guitar players, and he's pretty special.
Did you hear that Steve Perry finally came out and hit the stage
I heard he
the other
played
night?
with the Eels the other night.
Yeah, I did 3 songs.
Yeah, I read something. See, I'm on it. It said I read something that kept saying, "Oh, he's fat. He has no voice, and that's why he's not performing anymore." And they said, "No, still got the voice. No,
Yeah.
we're fine."
Exactly.
Yeah, I didn't.
And he
I'm
still
sure it's on
had a
YouTube.
crowd in his palm of his hand. It's all over YouTube. And he had the
Yeah.
crowd in the palm of his hand.
Yeah, I've been busy the last couple of days, but I read about it, I think yesterday, but I had to go out this morning. I drove out to Riverside, which is about, almost 75 miles, to buy a guitar. See, I'm still a guitar guy. I still love going to the Guitar Center and looking at guitars. I did it when I was 15. I do it now. You know what I mean? I just bought a guitar today that I'm just madly in love with. I spent the day out there playing a bunch of guitars. Anyway, so yeah. What about guitar players? I like talking about guitars and guitar players.
What did you buy?
I bought a Fender guitar, a Stratocaster for those musicians, and Fender does some great stuff. They have a custom shop whereby they make some great stuff. These guys today that are making guitars, everything they make. There's a lot of homage being paid to the guitars that were made in the 50s and 60s. And there's a particular builder there named Yuri Shishkov. They have these other things too that they're master built by one guy, and then Yuri built this, and it's pretty as fuck. Also, I wanted a Floyd Rose on a guitar, not since the '80s, and I guess they're getting popular again. So
Yeah, they are.
yeah, right. So I said, "Oh, I know how to use that. Listen to The Heat Is On." And so I went out there, and I've met him a couple times because I met him because he used to live in Chicago, and he was making guitars for Hamer, and he was, by virtue of that, he was making guitars for Robin Zander of Cheap Trick. So we sort of had that little place where I could, talk to him about that stuff, and I knew the guys at Hamer. So, Hamer made a little guitar for my daughter, who's now 24, but when she was a kid, they made me a little 3/4, sort of seafoam green Strat with her name at the headstock. And they did a good, they thought that that with one of the songs, I can't remember which one on a Cheap Trick record, that we really captured, Tom Peterson's 12-string or 8-string bass that he always played, and he felt like that was a good guy. His name is Joel Danzig, and he really felt that we'd sort of, kind of, I guess, nailed it is the right word. So he did that for me. Anyway, so yeah, this is Stratus, beautiful as hell. It's got a whammy bar, and I haven't had a Floyd Rose in a while. So, like I said, I'm a little kid.
So dive bombs all over the place?
Well, I have it about an hour and a half. So I haven't dived yet. But I did put the vibrato bar on. I'll probably get it set up tomorrow. And, and then bombs away.
Now, in the early 90s, you got the gig working with Poison on their first record with Richie Kotzen.
Yeah. And then Kotzen and I became very good friends.
Yeah, and I'm definitely going to get into that. I'm curious that to the beginning. Poison in the studio. You got Richie Kotzen, who was 20 or 21 or something at the time.
Yeah, like 22, I think.
Yeah, really young. They're a massive band, but I don't know if times were quite changing yet, or
Yeah, they were changing. They were changing.
Yeah,
they were changing drastically. Oh yeah, they were changing drastically. I mean, it took Bret Michaels again another decade probably to then find, his fame and place, due to some other things like some TV things he did and whatever else. Yeah, it changed drastically. CC left the band, who I didn't know at the time, but I got to know later on because I did a couple of other things with them. I did some studio stuff for a live record and something else. Also, I did there was a comedian named Sam Kinison, excuse me. And I did a version of a song called Wild Thing with him. And CC, I don't know if he played on it, but then he started, I met him then. Yeah, he must have played on it if I met him. And, so I got to know him later. But anyway, yeah, my initial contact with Poison was making a record, and Richie Kotzen was a guitar player. Because CC had just left. And Kotzen, was pretty brilliant, so they hired him.
Yeah.
So, let's hire the brilliant. Let's hire this guy. Although CC's a monster pop songwriter as well. But
oh, definitely.
Yeah. Yes, Kotzen was 22. Yes, it was Poison.
Behind the scenes on that particular record, in terms of the recordings, what was it like on that one?
Well, it was just great. I mean, it was they were finding that was, they grew up in Philadelphia, except for CC. CC and I went to the same junior high and same high school, like 10 years apart, oddly enough, in Brooklyn. But the rest of those guys came from, Pennsylvania, from rural Pennsylvania, and so did Kotzen. And so, they were still, they were finding their way through a new Poison. And Bret always had that sort of country, not country, well, yeah, a little bit of that sort of southern.
A little bit.
Yeah, a little bit of that southern rock thing, and I wish I knew his name. I apologize. But the keyboard player and piano player in Leonard Skinner came and played on that record. So, I got to experience Richie Kotzen, who was really and truly one of my favorite guitar players. And again, making that record, it was just we went in the studio, and I always looked at the studio sort of like the laboratory. And, we started putting things together, and we made a record that I'm quite proud of, especially a couple of songs. But again, it was a little different. In a minute, I guess it was grunge maybe, that started, and hip-hop. I'm not sure, because I think grunge, well, I hate that word, but a different type of, like, guitar-oriented music. In fact, oddly enough, Richie and Jerry Cantrell are pretty good pals, which I like, and I like rock and roll. I don't care what city it's made in, you know what I mean? I thought those guys are awesome. But things started to change, and then, it wasn't that long after, I don't think, that hip-hop started to change. And kind of hip-hop took the place, I think, of rock and roll in terms of rebellion, guy. Guys wanted to dress like gangsters instead of dressed like Steve Perry and getting girls, So, so things changed radically, but who cares? I was still having a good time, And then at Kotzen and I had a pretty good. We've been friends. He lives up the street from me, and I saw him we did a lot of records together. We really did, and especially like some of the stuff he did later by himself. Like we wrote one song on this album, one song on that album. We did an album called Wilson Hawk that the two of us. It was just the two of us. It was an album we did ourselves.
I'm fascinated by it because it was straight to iTunes. Your names were kind of off it, so
we didn't. We just made it. Him and I have always been very influenced by soul music. It's interestingly enough. I grew up again since I was in Atlantic. I was experienced. I was exposed early on to Wilson Pickett, Solomon Burke, Sam and Dave, and the list goes on. I love that stuff. I met Solomon Burke. I met Benny King. Anyway, so then there's Philadelphia, which has its own kind of soul, which was like the Old Jays and Gamble and Huff and the Spinners. And so, that's sort of out of that Philly R&B sound kind of came Hall & Oates, came Todd Rundgren, and that's what those guys were being spoon-fed. So anyway, we always wanted to make a soul record, and I always thought it would be fun because he had that Philly background, and I love Philly music. And, I had sort of the more Memphis influence stuff, and we said, let's go make a record. And we had a great time. And, because it was him, I mean, obviously it's more him than me because he sang all the songs. And I wrote it. We wrote like half together, and he wrote the other half by himself. So I will not, credit where credit's due. But he and I wanted to make a soul record. And again, what I was saying is because we're not, guys in this, we're not black guys in the 60s, it came out a little more like, a couple of white guys, so it didn't get as soul, and I don't mean soulful, I mean like, proper soul music. But we had a blast. It was one of my favorite records.
And why did you keep your names kind of off it?
Well, we wanted it to be a group, it wasn't like, he wanted it to be, it just seemed, it wasn't really meant, it was an interesting time in the record world, you know what I mean? The record companies, things were different. It was just prior to like the internet being such a, the only place to hear music. I mean, it already happened. I'm not sure what year we did that. And, but it wasn't about, neither one of us had a label affiliation. We sort of just made it and just put it on iTunes, and that was it. You know what I mean? Nobody was promoting it. Nobody was, active about it. So it wasn't about, well, let's put this out. And, you know what I mean? It wasn't about that. It was about, we just made it. And we wanted it, like, also he had and still does such a career as Richie Kotzen. There's no reason to confuse it with what he's doing. You know what I mean? It wasn't another Richie Kotzen record. So it was like, let's just keep this something separate.
Yeah, it was interesting because clearly would have been some form of label interest.
Well, we were approached by a few labels, and because at that time, one of the things that was going on was there were a lot of like sort of, bands making records. The indie label was starting to come really in fashion before sort of the internet sort of hurt them a lot, and so we got approached by a lot of. I don't want to say a lot, but more than one label that had, pretty good, distribution back then. And we decided, like, there wasn't enough dollars to make it worth anybody's while. You know what I mean? to you know what I mean? And I don't mean money to go in our pocket. I mean money to like sort of promote it and all that kind of stuff. And we really didn't see it that way. We really wanted to put it out ourselves.
After the Poison, I'll just jump back a little bit.
Yeah.
You stayed with Richie Kotzen and did Motherhead's Family Reunion.
Yeah. That's right.
That was another great record, but the label seemed to just kind of quietly pop it out there and it was over.
Yeah.
Like, what happened there?
Who knows? You know what I mean? It's almost like, it's, there are some things you can't control. In fact, everything. And, success, it has to line up. I think Richie's always been, he's such a, first of all, I'm a major fan. He's such a unique artist. You know what I mean? It's not about necessarily, making pop hit records. And that was an unusual time. Again, most of the stuff that was becoming successful was coming out of Seattle and had that, that sort of, that feel, that Nirvana had, and Alice in Chains, which is really one of my favorites, if not my favorite. But, so I don't know, just, they didn't feel, who knows? Yeah, I really don't know. You know what I mean? It's just that we made a great record. Some of it I think is great. He plays some of the stuff from that record. I've seen him play live, and he does, one or two of the things from that record that, that I love. He does a song from the Poison record called Stand, even with his band now with, the Winery Dogs. With Billy Sheehan and the drummer from, who I don't know, from Dream
Mike
Theater,
Portnoy.
I think. Yeah, Mike, there you go.
Yeah.
And it's, I saw them, probably the first tour, one of the first gigs, and he did Stand at the end, just him and guitar. And that song came from that Poison record. So, yeah, he's unique, you know what I mean? He found his own, because of the internet nowadays, you don't have to fit into those little things, and he's like got a big touring base outside of America, like South America and Europe, and nowadays you can really build it again. And like at one time, people forget, like the Beatles played like God knows how many gigs before they had a record deal, so that when they signed and got on stage, they could really play. And Kotzen is the deal. So I can't say enough things about him that because I really do think he's a sensational musician.
It's funny because the Winery Dogs, like, it's not too far removed from what he's been doing for the last 20 years.
Well, the thing about Richie is that, he sings brilliantly. He's a brilliant guitar player. And, he's a good writer and a great writer and a, great co-writer. And the thing is, who else in the band is going to compete with that?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Who else is going to do that job in a band?
Yeah.
So, I've just never seen him in a band. Probably Poison was the beginning was the exception because, Brett was the lead singer. And, but everything since then, Richie's been, the main voice. So it's very hard to separate that. But it's a cool band.
Except Mr. Big, which you worked with him too.
Yeah, and I co-wrote a song called Shine on that record that I'm really proud of. He wrote most of it, but I helped a little. And
and it was a number one hit in Japan.
It did good in Japan. Yeah, it was good.
Yeah, it was number one.
Yeah, okay, you win. And I really didn't know that. And I knew it was successful, and they used it on a couple TV shows. Actually, it was one, I think, Japanese anime, something called Hellsing. I don't know if it was animated or not. I did one of the first Japanese animation movies, which I'm also very proud of. It was called Project Eiko, and that was like 1980-ish, 79 maybe.
Oh, interesting.
And there wasn't that much Japanese anime out at that time, I don't think.
You did the full soundtrack then on that,
yeah.
You said? Yeah,
co-wrote all the songs, and it was very 80s song-oriented.
Yeah.
The 80s had a sound. I got a friend that he's kind of nutty. I'm just where I can say he's nutty because I don't have to mention his name. He's not super successful yet. He's young. He's starting. He's very, very much into the electronic dance music, and he studies. These guys study the '80s, and the synthesizers that were used. I mean, just they study it. I mean, they want to use the things that were, that have been sampled over the years, but now. If you go back, you have way more flexibility and whatever. And so the soundtrack has a lot to do with the 80s, that particular soundtrack in terms of synths and the kind of pop synth. But yes, we did all the music. My partner, a guy named Joey Carbone, who sort of went on to be very successful in Japan. He found his niche there as a writer and producer and businessman.
In the mid-'90s, the music landscape changed.
Uh-huh.
What did that mean for you?
Well, I mean, everybody has their opinion, Like, I think that, each generation, has their own music. And I think that music belongs to those people. I think when you get, because I get sort of I don't know about philosophical. I get philosophical and sociological about music too. Because, I always feel that the arts had something to do with, either chronicling the culture or whatever. And that period, of the 70s, well, late 60s, 70s, and, up, kind of a little bit through the 80s. I mean, arguably that's sort of the heyday of the kind of music that I cut my teeth on. And I was okay by the 90s because it was different. And, I was different. So I didn't sort of feel as connected as a record maker, although I got the music, you know what I mean? So it affected me in that I felt, it's hard to articulate it, but it's easier now looking back, is that, sometimes it's just time to say, next. And I felt that. I mean, it's also like, it's not so much, because it was interesting because, the records that, again, I tend to look at Seattle as, as something that was necessary to sort of like change, because at that time MTV Rock was MTV Rock, and I think it was time for something new. And the guys up in Seattle had it, they really did. But then right afterwards, listen, I don't sit there and look at the dates so much, but like I said earlier, I think the hip-hop generation really became stronger. Hip-hop really hit, the center of the culture harder than the sort of northern United States kind of music. I don't want to call it grunge. I hate it. It's rock and roll. I talked to Jerry Cantrell. He said, "Dude, this is rock and roll," and he's so right because he didn't just start. Okay, I'm going to play grunge now. He's a brilliant musician, artist, guitar, all that. But then, as that rock world was changing, it also was, in my opinion, being pushed out of the center of the culture, and that was hip hop. Took hold, and that's where I felt the most sort of like I love this stuff, but really and truly, I don't, there's nothing in here for me to do. You know what I mean? Because I've always been attracted. It's like I do have an ego, and I've always been attracted to the stuff that's been mass market. I've never been sort of Mr. Secular. And so at that point, as hip hop really and truly took center stage, I became a little less interested in making records, frankly. And I did some other things, and I do stuff because I keep busy. Like recently, I worked on a couple of the seasons of American Idol. I produced some of the vocals for the kids, which was great. Like half of, I think this season, I don't pay attention anymore, but last season I worked on some and the one before. So, I tend to do things that I think are, interesting. But yeah, mid-90s, things started to change radically. And, The Chronic and Dr. Dre, they were the Beatles. I heard Jimmy Iovine said to a friend of mine, he said that, here's the Chronic record he was playing for him. He said, this is like the hip-hop, Sgt. Pepper. And I don't think he was wrong.
Yeah.
He hasn't been wrong a lot. I knew him when I was like a puppy, when I was 15 or 16. We're from the same hood.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he was a musician, in a band like the rest of us back then. But anyway, so I think that is really and truly what sort of changed my, my perspective of making records. It's just, what I mean? At that point, what do I do? Because I always loved, I got to say, I was so blessed to spend time with Giorgio Moroder, and whoever doesn't know who he is, look him up, because I learned so much about the European sort of synth. Basically they only invented a certain number of synthesizers, and they started sampling them. And, I cut my teeth on those. From a guitar player's perspective, for sure, but, you know what I mean? Just being in that world where that stuff was being, utilized to its fullest, So, I'm not a stranger to electronic music. I'm not a stranger to things that are not to use the word organic, but they're not necessarily played, in a room by 5 people. And so you know what I mean? So but then when I again cut to now, I love Katy Perry's last single. There's a lot of records I think are really, really good. Really and truly. But it's always been that way. There'll be 20 songs in 6 months that are great and nothing else. But it doesn't matter who's making them. But again, if you want a song, like Katy Perry's second single, they're all, I hate to sound like this because I don't really read the credits as much as I used to. They're harder to find on the frickin' internet. But anyway, so like Dr. Luke and Max Martin, I'm pretty well dominating, a lot of the pop records, which it's all good, but that's, when you have the same guy doing every record, it's interesting. It's sort of a phenomenon. What happens is, the days of the entire album are kind of gone. So instead of those guys being locked in a room for 6 to 9 to 10 to 12 to 16 weeks with an artist, they cut a track, boom, next artist. So before you know it, you pick every artist, 2 hits within the first year, within a 12-month to 18-month period, you got a lot of stuff that has a lot in common. Then they get and then it was funny because the hip-hop artists would then start to integrate singers into their genre, then it kind of flip-flopped, and the pop artists are bringing, MCs, I guess, not DJs, hip-hop rappers. I hate those words like rapper and shit. And then it changed again, which I'm loving, and DJs are now sort of, getting their own and creating tracks and then getting singers And I don't know how many of those guys are actually musicians. You know what I mean? I don't know how many of those tracks originate from other people's samples, or I don't really know or care, but I know they are actually DJs. I mean, for me, the thing that's cool about that is that, hip hop was never, again, I didn't study it, but it wasn't really, it didn't seem like it really transcended into the live, arena. It wasn't really a concert thing. I don't think anyway. I'm pretty sure I'm right. And sort of the rock concert, sort of unless you're 70, those kind of days are not really here anymore at the moment. But the clubs are again. So when you get those like DJs and they're making cool tracks and they're getting, people to sing on them, I think it's bringing people out into the world again, which I think is good. You know what I mean? Just sort of interacting, whether it's dancing or not, but sort of experiencing music in a live, situation.
Do you think guitar music the next cycle will bring any guitar music back?
Hard to say. Who knows? I mean, I can sit there while I'm on the phone, but I'm sitting in front of my little rig. I work with Logic and stuff, and I got some cool shit around here. And, I can make a track in 10 minutes. You know what I mean? You may not love it, but I can make one. Before you can make a noise on a guitar, you got to roll up your sleeves and sit there for a couple of years. So it depends on how many people. I know I walk into the guitar store, there's still people playing, riffs from the 70s and a little bit of Jack White. They'll play a little dun 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 dun. So, I mean, the kids that are playing guitar are listening to, Eddie Van Halen, Jimmy Page, all those guys. And because they don't have anybody they could, listen to now that I can think of. And so will there be, I don't know. I mean, there are kids learning how to play guitar.
It never really goes away.
No, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, we're talking about, forget the Beatles, even previous, prior to the Beatles. You can listen to that sort of Buddy Holly, that's, sort of 50s, Chuck Berry guitar playing. I mean, if you go back to the 50s and then take it through, now, or, the millennials, that's a lot of years. That's half a century, you know what I mean? So, it's as long as they're making records that, the DJs are controlling, I don't mean controlling, but I mean, dictating the musical outcome, as long as you got guys like, I imagine Max Martin and Dr. Luke and whoever else. I always liked the Swedes. They always made the best, coolest pop. They just know how to make pop songs. They're not coming from a guitar perspective. Like when Mutt Lange, who I think is also a genius, he was writing pop songs and having, monster hits. He was recording guitars. I mean, that was his starting point. You know what I mean? That was the accompaniment to the vocal and the song. But who knows? Maybe it'll come back. The day of the guitar hero. I don't know. I think Mark Zuckerberg is a rock star. You know what I mean? It's a different world out there. So
yeah, it is.
Now it's gone back to it's if you're a musician, you're a musician. If you like to play music, you play music. You know what I mean? And sort of mainstream, notoriety, might be mutually exclusive to to playing instruments and writing songs. But there's always going to be great songwriters. There's always going to be great singers. It's almost like sometimes I think it's like if like a guitar player, someone today that could want to be a guitar player 25, 30 years ago, just may not be as sort of stimulated because he doesn't hear it as much on the radio. So, I think there might be some untapped talent more than anything else. But who knows? You know what I mean?
You could argue the flip to that they have access to everything now with the internet. So if
They
you're looking
do.
for it, you can find it.
They do. Oh, no question. But it's interesting. It's one thing, like I said, I was on Atlantic, and, there used to be things called records. They were big and they were black, and you needed needles to play them. And and they sounded darn good. But they couldn't fit in anything small, and the scratches made them difficult. Anyway, like many things, before they went to manufacturing, they had such a thing as, they would make test pressings, like any of the prototype, make sure before they pressed a bunch of records, everything was all, copacetic. Anyway, so at Atlantic, someone handed me a test pressing and said, here, take this home, it's the new Yardbirds. And it was the first Led Zeppelin record. So you know what I mean? Access to everything, no question. being there at the moment that shit's being created, whole other set of circumstances.
True.
You know what I mean? It's like the kids that were listening to, 50 Cent and Eminem for the first time, at their age, 16, that's when you were 16 and Led Zeppelin was forming and, sitting in, Central Park, sitting in the front row, looking up at the stage and seeing those guys. It was like, God, seeing Hendrix for the first time live. Now you have to settle for looking back.
And as somebody who's so in depth in the history of music, to work on American Idol with the kids coming up, what makes you enjoy doing that?
Well, yeah, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, I have my own opinions about, I don't want to come off condescending, but I sometimes can't help it. You get to a certain age. I mean, I'm not necessarily into win a career in a cereal box kind of mentality. But, going in the studio with someone who, it was their first time in the studio. Because what I did is I worked on the songs, on the record versions, the iTunes versions, in the studio, right? I was producing the vocals, exactly is what I was doing. And, watching those 16-year-old wide-eyed kids, it was pretty sensational because they were sort of, picked out of nowhere and planted in, here you go, kid. You're now on the biggest show on television. So there's a beauty to that, but then there's also there's something I connect a little more with, with someone who's, paid a little more dues. Not that these kids got an easy shot, but they didn't get, they're how do I say this? It's I don't think it's necessarily a good thing to be exposed to that many million people when you haven't had a chance to really get out there and develop so that that amount of, that many millions of people get to see you at your best, as opposed to just, being, it's almost like being picked off the vine before you had a chance to ripen.
I would agree, because you look at how few have really sustained any success after. There's only a handful.
Well, I think, again, it happened also prior to American Idol. There's no reason to mention names. But when you start picking them off the vine too early, you're missing the point. But, we live in a pretty instant gratification society. So it's what are you going to do? You can't get mad at the planet. You know what I mean? But I think, again, the key difference is, back in the day, and, you had to be able to pull it off live, and you had to be able to do that before someone paid any attention to you and took you into the studio. Now, it still exists. I mean, there wouldn't be bands like, Mumford & Son, whether you like or don't like their music or care or know who they are, it doesn't matter. There's the guys making songs and people are paying attention. I saw Imagine Dragons at the beginning of this album, and they were talking to the audience, and it was like, okay, I'm back in LA, and those of you guys who were with us, I mean, the beginning was only 2 years ago or 3 years ago or 4 years ago, and but they paid their dues. They played shows in the last couple of years, and who I love is this girl. Is it Haley? I don't know her last name, from Paramore, and I like that band, and I started to read about her, and she's young as can be, but she started at 16. I started reading some of the stuff that she was doing. You know what I mean? Had she gone the TV quick, not that whether or not she was offered it to me is irrelevant. The fact that she got to sort of mature as her career was growing, I think sort of the proof is in the pudding on that level. But again, what do I know? What the fuck do I know? Really and truly, it's almost like, so what? You know what I mean? It's all about, if you're an artist, you're an artist. And, if your heart belongs to art and your soul belongs to art, whether it be music, of course mine is music, that's who you are, that's what you are, that's what you put on the planet to be and to do. And however you find your audience and however big or small your audience is, the truth is in the art, as far as I'm concerned.
There you go. There's my chat with Richie Zito. Hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you follow us on Twitter at The Double Stop and subscribe on iTunes. We'll see you next Monday.
Welcome to another day. The promises I know.